Hello, this is Damien Sebouhian, and you're listening to and watching Builders of the Light Web. And this is a new series that we're trying out called Love, Loss, and Transformation, where I interview people one-on-one about loss and how they overcame that loss. It's also about love. The loss has to be somebody that they or something that they loved deeply and dearly, and they lost, and how they recovered from it. And we're going to begin each episode with a reading called The Buddha and the Grieving Mother. And speaking of mother, my first guest is going to be my mother, Rose Sebouhian, who's in Western New York, and I'm in Arkansas right now. So this is The Buddha and the Grieving Mother. During the time of the Buddha, a woman named Gautami lost a child to disease. She was so sad that she went before Buddha, still holding her child in her arms. "Please bring him back to life for me," she cried. Very gently, Buddha answered her. "I can help you, Gautami, but first you must bring me one small mustard seed from a household where no one has ever died." Gautami quickly went out in search of a mustard seed, but everywhere she went, the same thing happened. Everyone wanted to help her, but someone had died in every family she visited. At the end of the day, she returned to the Buddha. "What have you found, Gautami?" he asked. "Where is your mustard seed? And where is your son? You are not carrying him any longer." She answered Buddha, "Today I have discovered that I am not only one who has lost a loved one. Everywhere people have died. I see how foolish I was to think I could have my son back. I have accepted his death, and this afternoon I buried him. Now I have returned to you to hear your teachings. I am ready to listen." Then the Buddha said, "Gautami, you have learned a great deal today. Death must come to everyone sooner or later, but if you learn the truth, you can live and die in happiness. Come, I shall teach you." So if you would unmute yourself, dear mother. I still can't hear you. Maybe I can unmute you. There you go.
Okay. And do I hit got it?
Nope, that's all. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Good.
Okay.
So you've read this story before? You know of it?
Yes, I know of it.
And what were your initial thoughts when you read that story?
Well, the immediate thought was about my brother, my baby brother, Steve, who was killed in Vietnam in 1967, April 23rd to be exact, and how my mother and the family dealt with that. And I immediately felt what the mother, what the woman in Buddha felt, the mother and the Buddha, and because now I'm a mother, and how my mother handled grief was absolutely amazing. So I don't know how, if you want me to go on expand about that, or talk about.
Yeah, we'll go on from there. So yeah, you had a mother who lost a son, so that's very very relatable to that story. But so you're given the assignment of choosing somebody to talk about, and you've chosen.
My mother. In
And
fact, I have a picture of her graduation picture. I don't know if you can see this with the glare and all, but this was her. She was born in 1912, so 18 years later. This was my mother, and she was a city girl. She grew up in Troy, Ohio, and ended up marrying my father, who was a farmer in a little rural community of Danville, Ohio.
All right. So this we have 4 questions and there's some sub questions in there too. So the first question is, describe someone or something that you loved with all of your heart, but that died or left or ended in some way. What was the nature of the relationship, and what did that person or thing mean to you at the time of that relationship? So this is prior to your mother dying. Just what was the overall relationship like?
we were, all of us, she had, as I said, she was a city girl. She had moved to Danville. She saw my father riding a white horse, and she was interested and wanted to find out who that man was. So she saw the way he went on the horse up Route 62 in Danville, Ohio. And she followed, and she walked probably about a mile and a half. And she then saw him in this big field. And she said to me, when I went over to introduce myself, he winked at me. So that was the beginning of their relationship. They married, they had 6 children. And when you say my relationship with her, she was the heart of the family. Without her, Dad could not have made it as a successful farmer. And so we were all, especially the 3 younger kids, me, my brother Steve, who was killed in Vietnam, as I mentioned, and my sister Betty. We were called the 3 Musketeers, and we got into all kinds of trouble on the farm, but it was fun trouble, you know. And but my mother was there. She was a steady rock. And when you talk about Buddha and the death, so the death of her son was the most traumatic of her whole life. And she became a writer after his death. She became an anti-war advocate. She found her voice, and the letters she wrote into the newspapers, to the congressman, Stephen Young especially, a senator from Ohio. And she became an advocate for the Vietnam, all those protesters. It was just amazing. I saw a woman who became this advocate. She became an incredible writer, passionate writer. She was, of course, a Gold Star mother. And so she was my hero, frankly.
Nice. And so that happened. Her relationship to the family sort of changed, and that was when most everybody was raised and out of the household at that point.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, we were all out of the household, and I was married at Miami University when we got the call that he had been killed. And it was just a very agonizing, and we're still getting over it, because I don't want to spend too much time on it.
Yeah.
But the fact was, we were lied to about his death, and as many were, many parents of veterans of that war. But anyway, she was my rock. And I have one important story about this. The night before we got the word that Steve was killed, she had a dream. And she dreamed that he was on a tractor, on a wagon, on a hay wagon. Wagon was going away from her, and she suddenly saw a massive explosion. And his head was dragging on the ground, his feet on the bars of the wagon. And she's screaming after him, running after him, stop, stop, stop. And then she woke up, and she's sobbing, and she realizes that he's dead, that he is gone. And so she woke Dad, and she said, and he's gone. I know he's gone. I've had this dream. So so that morning, Dad had to go down about 5 a.m. to milk the cows, and he looked up, he heard a car coming down the lane, and it was the Army, U.S. Army, and he knew, and he howled, he cried, then he knew immediately that Mom's dream was true. And so she was psychic. There are other stories about her dreams and her abilities in that regard. So that was, to me, the most important. She knew that, and that, by the way, was how he died. He was in a track, and it hit a landmine near Chu Chi, Vietnam, and he and a boy named Russell were killed. burned alive. In fact, we found out much later, several years later, that not only because we had gotten a letter that said he died with the help was right there with him. He'd never suffered. That was all a lie. He burned for 2 days. Nobody knew that he was at the bottom of the track because everybody was injured. And so they didn't know until 2 days later when they took the already now burned out track to the compound, opened the gate, and there they found 2 bodies. One was my brother. But we never knew that until years later when one of the men on that track that was injured seriously found us and told us the true story of what happened, which made her, a campaign worth everything she went through to stop this war.
So it sounds like in that part of her life, prior or after Steve's death, that really affected the trajectory of her life course.
Absolutely. And she realized, I said, Mom, you are a writer. You are a writer. And she, throughout that year, throughout those years, because this was 67, the war didn't end till, what is it, 72, something like that. And that inspired us to continue our campaign against the war. And George and I, your father, and that's when we were investigated for our activity, and all we did was peacefully protest. So all of this was going on while Mom and Dad, now Mom had to take over, help Dad. And so here she is in, I don't know, her 60s probably, had to go down to the barn and help Dad, had to drive the tractor again. I mean, she used, this is a picture, I don't know if you can see this, but she was, again, a city girl who had to learn, this is a big workhorse. I know it's hard to see with the glare, but she's got a hat on that has a veil to protect her from the horse flies, and she's got a little switch in her hand. And this workhorse was named Jack, and there's a lot of stories about Jack, but she had to learn all of that as a farmer. She had to learn how to gut a chicken. We had chicken, for dinner. She had to learn to milk cows. And I think one of the worst stories, and funny in a way, when she was pregnant with her first child, Dolores, Dad had gotten a new bull and he hadn't told Mom, and she was out in the field gathering the cows in, and all of a sudden she sees this animal that's pawing the ground and looking at her, and she is 9 months pregnant.
Wow.
So she has to somehow get to the fence and get over, or he's going to kill her. He's going to attack because, and so she runs as much as a 9 month pregnancy could, and she was able to climb the front fence just as he rammed his huge head into the post of the fence. But she was able to get over, and that night she had Dolores, and all the 3 older kids were born at home. And so she had Dolores that night. That running triggered labor.
And did Dolores end up having a bullish personality?
She had a very no. She didn't. No, that was funny. Yeah. Anyway, no, she ended up. We all loved the farm, but Dolores, and Dolores always wanted to go far away and travel, and that's what she eventually did. She married a diplomat. They lived in Greece and Pakistan. They traveled all over.
She wanted to get away from that bull. That almost killed her.
Oh no, the bull didn't know. He was just being a bull.
Yeah. All right. So how did the nature of your relationship change after? Because Grandpa Will died, and how long between his death and her death was there? She had time, all that time alone for a while, right?
Yeah, he died in 1989, and she died at the age of 92 in June 27, 2004. So from 1989 to 2004. And I remember he she used to laugh and say, "Oh yeah, your dad never thought I could do my books or take care of the farm, but look at this." And she had a successful farm. She continued, doing what he had already said she couldn't do. He was a very sexist man, but that was what, most of the men were. They were the head of the household. He never ever consulted her in anything. He would buy a car. It was always a used car. And he would buy a car, never tell her he was buying a car. The home that she loved, they left. I won't get into that, but he bought a farm. He never told her that he bought the neighboring farm, and they just, I mean, it was like that. And I always think that and he said on his deathbed, "I couldn't have done it without you, Gert." Her name was Gertrude, and he always called her Gert. He was the only one that she allowed to call her Gert. But and I thought it took all those years for him to tell her that. Why? Because she would, I mean, that's what I learned from her too. How the strength that she had, not only in the death of her son, but having to put up with a man who, I love my dad, but he could be harsh. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it sounded like he didn't relate to his feelings openly to
No, oh no. It was very difficult for him to talk about his feelings. Period.
All right. So how did your relationship because you lived in Ohio pretty much like as next door neighbors for several years, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, when we moved to Ohio to help her, really to help her. I wanted to be with her. She wasn't ill yet, but we moved there in 2000, and I wanted to be with her when she did die. And so that was another very, if I could say, go on about how she died, because it was very,
Well, let me just read this. So that leads us to the second question. Describe
yeah.
the person, how your relationship ended. How did this death affect you at the time? So yeah, go ahead and talk about the
Okay. If I can backtrack a second, one of the other important parts of her life, she had been a Methodist all those years. Dad was Catholic, and for them to get married in 1930 in Danville, Ohio, where a Catholic marries a Protestant, it was very controversial. And anyway, so she converted into Catholicism and became a devout Catholic. And I am going to reach that in a minute, talk about that in a minute. But that's important in her life, so that we were, all of us then were raised Catholic. So, all right. What was the question? That was about how she died, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. She had told Betty, unknowns to me at the time, she had told Betty, that Betty is my youngest sister, that she would not die unless Rose or she were there. And so 6 weeks before my mother took to bed, her baby sister, Aunt Evelyn, who was in her, she was 80, I believe. Anyway, she was 89. They lived a nice long life. Anyway, she died. And when Aunt Evelyn died, Mom decided, and we saw her becoming depressed about it. And then one day she said, "I'm done. I don't want to live anymore. I've lived a good life." And so she stopped eating. We got a hospital bed. We brought it into the living room. And that was like on a Saturday. And so we gave her ice chips and things, and she took to bed. And I remember her granddaughter, Jennifer, who lived in California, says, Grandma, please, called her and said, "Please hold on, I'm coming." And I'll never forget, Mom said, "Well, that's wonderful, Jennifer, but what if I rally? And then you you will have spent all that money on a ticket. And she said, Grandma, I'm coming regardless. You got to hang on. And so that week, she was in and out. She slept a lot. And I remember her, this would be her great great grandson, who was like a toddler. And his mother brought him to my mother, who was on the bed. And she put him, who he was just a little toddler, on her lap. She was lying down on her chest. And he says, Grandma, I have a blanket just like this. And he's touching the silk of the blanket, and mom wakes up and she pats his little hand. And that was such a moving thing, because here you have a great great grandson and a 92-year-old woman connecting. So at the end of that, and people came from, so on a Wednesday, she died that next Saturday. On a Wednesday, she says, Rose, will you call Father Snoke? I called George W. Bush a son of a bitch. And she said that you shouldn't say that about anybody. And I'm afraid it's going to delay my entry. And I wanted to laugh, because of that, if that's the only sin I ever have, I thought to myself, I'd be one lucky woman. So I said, Mom, of course I'll call Father Snoke. Now you have to know, Father Snoke was a wonderful, he looked like Moses. He had a big beard, and he was, anyway, he loved Mom. He was a Republican, she was a Democrat. They talked politics, and they were very close. I mean, he was just a wonderful man. So I called him, and he said, I'll be right there. So he sat down with her, and he took her hand, and he said, Gertrude, what's bothering you? What can I do? And she said, oh, Father, I called George W. Bush a son of a bitch. You shouldn't say that about anybody. I'm afraid it's going to delay my entry. And he looked at her, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, Gertrude, you let God worry about George W. Bush. And Damien, I saw this sense of relief. She smiled. You could just see that burden that she had been carrying around was released by that beautiful man. That was the perfect thing he could have said to her. Yeah. So then the end, I will tell you then, remember what she said to my sister. I will. So anyway, so all of us were there. This was about let's say 10 o'clock at night. Dolores was sleeping in one bedroom, and we would take turns checking on her. By this time, she's in a coma. So anyway, I go out about 5 to 11, and I check and make sure she hasn't wet and all of that. And I then put a blanket back around her, and I go into the bedroom. She's still breathing, everything is fine. And as I'm about to sit down on the bed to go to sleep, I hear in my brain, Rose! And it was like that. It was just like that. And I go running out. No, I mean, it's in my brain. And I remember looking in the clock, and it's 11 o'clock. And as I look at her, I see a light that is on her face, and it goes up like this and disappears. I saw, and I believe with all my heart, that was what we call soul. Her soul was departing the body, and she was, by the time I touched her, I knew that she was dead. But that's what I mean. She was psychic. There was a psychic quality about her. And there are other stories I could tell you, but the death of her was one of the most beautiful things that we all experienced. And the fact that she told Betty that she would not leave until either she or I or both of us were there. That was her strength. She controlled how she was going to die. I mean, and it was amazing, and that she did control her death, and it was a beautiful. We had a beautiful celebration of life at a beautiful mass. A wonderful friend who was an incredible piano player played. She loved Sophie Tucker's "One of These Days I'm Gonna Miss You, Honey," and she wanted him to play that at her funeral, and he did, really slowly and beautifully. It was just amazing, and everything was a celebration. You had read things about her, and it was a beautiful. It was just beautiful. Pies and pies and pies. I
That's
remember
right.
that.
I remember. I wrote a poem.
That's right.
Yeah. Um, so even though it was, you're painting it as kind of a positive, uplifting story. She was a woman who got to choose her death. She had lived her whole life. She was in her 90s. She got to live over 10 years sort of by herself without her husband. And so she got to have a new kind of life.
Yes.
So after she died, though, did was were you ever troubled by the loss? Did you miss her? Was there pain after that? From that, how did you recover?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, your father, I want to just talk about that in a second, gave the eulogy, and they did not like each other at the beginning. She did not. First of all, he was 11 and a half years older than I was. Had just graduated. I knew him 4 months, and we got married. We had a terrible accident on our honeymoon. All of these things she blamed him for. She didn't want any of her girls to marry. That's why she was ahead of her time. She wanted them to travel. She wanted us to travel, to be independent. And as it turns out, George then, when she realized what a great guy he was, he became her best friend. And that's, when dad died, she wanted him by her side. So, I mean, her husband, she wanted George by. So I mean, it was just, was I sad? I think about her all the time. I think about her all the time. And I think as parents get older, that they do think about their own parents. And I think about dad, and I think dad, I talk to him all the time. You were not good to her. You could have been better to her. You could have realized what a beautiful, hardworking woman she was and what she did for the family. And without her, he would not have been as successful. And to his credit, he admitted that to her. Yeah, we were all sad, but the sadness wasn't. I mean, she was 92, almost 93, and when she died, and it was a beautiful death and a beautiful celebration. And she got to see grandkids. She got in her home, and she did not suffer. She did not suffer.
Mhm.
But it was a beautiful gift. It was a beautiful gift, and she helped me not worry about death. She helped me to accept it. Of course, she wasn't a young 20-year-old redheaded boy who was blown apart in Vietnam. So you know what I'm saying? That but I don't think of her without thinking of him and what she lost when he was killed, her baby. And everybody was crazy about Steve. Nobody fought with Steve. Nobody, I mean, he was just one hell of an incredibly wonderful guy. And for her and her strength that she carried that loss to protest that war. I mean, this was a small town. She was called a communist. She was told by friends, get over it. It's making you bitter. All those things she was told. So yeah, and she carried on. Yeah, were we sad? Well, of course, I miss her. I miss her. I talk to her. I see her. I shouldn't go on about that. But
Wait, what do you mean? You see her.
why? Well, all of us are kind of psychic. But I see things and I've always seen things as a little girl. But I've seen her a couple times,
Mhm.
and she always has that crooked little smile. But I see her. I've seen your dad too.
Um, so we only have a couple minutes left. What would you say what would be your advice for somebody who has to deal with loss of a loved one and about dealing with death in general?
Well, I think the hardest death, I'll just give you this example, was Kenny, as me, my brother-in-law. And your dad and Kenny had all kinds of plans they were going to do when he retired. And Kenny had a very bad cancer that was probably caused by his work in a paint factory, the chemicals that he breathed and all. And his death was terrible, was painful. And I was there at his death, and so was your dad, and he died at home. But my point is, um, that was a terrible experience with death. So I've seen the good and I've seen the bad. But what I would say is the best gift you can give is to be there and to hold the hand, the person's hand. And I think that also another thing is to comfort those around, you know, bring meals. That, I mean, growing up in a farm, that was when somebody was in trouble, we would bake, we would send things, we would go over. And I think that tradition should continue, and let the person talk about the deceased. Just listen. That's what I've learned. I mean, just be there, hold her hand, comfort the people around, and let them talk. You listen. That's, but death is not. See, I believe that mom is still here. The spirits are still around us. They never leave us.
Mhm.
And I just, so I don't, I'm not afraid, and I'm not afraid to die. I'm not, it's, but I will choose how I die. I mean, if I, well, I will not go on, but
Yeah, that's all right. So we're the meeting is about to end. I'm going to stop recording.